Okay. Thank you, and appreciate your kind words. And it's a gift to work with him too. I did not know Bishop Hayes before 2004, but we spend more time together than probably either of us enjoy sometimes these days. But it's a gift to be here in Oklahoma. There are people here in this room that I went to seminary with, and others that we've worked on ministries and projects with over the years, and it's always just a joy to be with you. And as a matter of fact, I was surprised, one of your retired members, it was my supervising pastor during my internship back when I was 22 years old, Bill Hathaway. And so what a gift to see Bill and Jenny here. So anyway, it's good to be with you. Now, I receive a fair number of invitations to speak around, and most of the time that's on the 5 practices of fruitful congregations, sometimes on 5 practices of fruitful living. In the last couple of years, extravagant generosity. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be in Durant in February for the 5 practices, and doing some work with your foundation and one of the other districts in August on extravagant generosity. So looking forward to those engagements as well. But I've also, in the lead up to General Conference this year, kind of got involved with thinking about systems that are conducive to our ministries and systems that are not conducive to our ministries. And I contracted to do with a blog series with Ministry Matters that I, in developing that, thought of the title, came up with the title of Remember the Future, which is kind of meant to jog you. Remember is back, and so how does this work? Well, what I was trying to communicate is I wanted that phrase to run so deep in those preparing for General Conference that in every conversation someone would say, but we've got to remember the future. You can see how well that worked. So I've been invited today to talk about kind of organizational leadership type stuff, which is, well, I've done a lot of that reading and study in that area, do a lot of teaching within my own conference and cabinet. I really haven't done that much of kind of focus on innovation and experimentation and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I'm experimenting with you a little bit today, and would love your feedback to see if this is useful at all. This is a time of astounding flux and fluidity and recalibration in the life of our church at every level. Local church, conferences, general church, we're all kind of trying to find our bearings. And somebody asked me as we were gathering, what am I working on these days? Actually, I haven't written a single thing since General Conference. Not a blog, not a single newsletter article, nothing. And I'm not pouting or anything, but there is kind of almost a low-grade depression or that I'm having to figure out where we are. It's kind of like I'm struggling. Where are we as a church? And then where am I in terms of my own ministry? And how do these relate? And so I'm just in one of those seasons of kind of figuring that out. And I think we all go through that at various times in ministry. But I've been asked to speak today on some of the related material, kind of ideas around organizational leadership and the future and some of the changes going on and that kind of thing. And it's going to be a bit of a convoluted conversation today, but stick with me, and maybe as you're driving home, it'll start to come together in some meaningful way. And if it does, let me know what the common thread is. There are genres of organizational leadership literature that I just disdain in the church. And so for me to be doing this is kind of a stretch, because I got to figure out what am I going to do that's different from these that I don't like. So one of those styles is the writings of what I call, is that coming up there? Okay. The writings by those who look at leadership and organizational issues in the church. They write from the perspective of what I call the ethereal saint. Well, you just have to trust the Lord. It's not fruitfulness, it's faithfulness that matters. We just have to pray and trust the Holy Spirit. don't worry about anything. That if God, wants a different future for the United Methodist Church, it will happen in God's time. And until that, we've just got to wait for the Lord. Now, I find this, downright uncarnational. It's unreal. It's wishful thinking. It's asking God to do for us exactly what God created us to do for God. Right? In our traditional constructs, this would be docetism. It is, and it's a form of avoidance, and it's a form of denial, the ethereal saint. So I hope that our conversations don't turn that way. But there's another kind of organizational leadership literature in the church that I have a little trouble with, and that's what I call the technocrat. And this is the person who entirely and wholesale kind of takes business organizational literature and just assumes it's all going to work in the church. So this is organizational corporate analysis, executive language, effectiveness, metrics. Now I've read this literature all my ministry, and I commend it to you. There are things to learn. As Albert Outler used to say, we got to plunder the Egyptians. We steal what we're going to steal. We got to take from here and there and everywhere. And so I hope, and so there are things we can learn from this, but we can't just transfer all that learning about organizations into the United Methodist Church and think it's all going to work. That there's, some of this language is, it's like everything's linear. It's all cause and effect. It's predictable. There's an explanation for everything. There's a strategy for every situation. And a lot of this technocrat kind of leadership literature doesn't account for just the messiness and unpredictability of church life, or the interruption of the Spirit, and how that happens and changes people and changes organizations and changes churches in ways we could not imagine. Well, there's the third kind of leadership organizational stuff for the church out there that is written by the doomsayer. There is no hope. It's all gloominess, and all the trends are down, and it's all too little, too late. And this kind of gloominess defeats the Spirit. It creates the organizational equivalent of a panic attack that just paralyzes organizations, paralyzes churches, gives a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. And if anything, it directs our attention toward the very minimum of just how do we struggle to survive? How do we fix things enough to, be here another day, another year, and so forth like that? And I think my biggest trouble with it as a person of faith is it uses fear as the primary motivator. Now, we got a lot of churches in the United States, and usually many of them are of other denominations. But you know what I'm talking about, that use fear as the cohesive element of community. It's a dark and scary world out there, and we're the only ones that have an answer, and so you got to be safe in here. So, well, fear is just not, short term maybe gets a little people doing this, that, and the other, but long term, it's to play on fear or to use that as a driving motivator to create a sense of urgency is a contradiction to our sacrament of baptism, which is about hope and new life and the activity of God. And so, but doomsdayer and technocrat, they also have no room for the Spirit or interruption or resurrection. And I just, so these are the kind of literature I don't much care for. Some of you who I knew in seminary, if you want to, kind of look at how history just doesn't run in linear patterns. Back when I was in seminary in the late 70s, early 80s, you know what the key social justice issues that we were wrestling with as, enthusiastic, idealistic seminary students at Perkins? Apartheid in South Africa. Endless war in Central America. The Holocaust, the impending Holocaust and the Cold War. And none of us could have imagined at that point that those things would have just, fallen to the background over the years, and that we'd be where we are now with a different set of things. Well, we don't know what the future holds. It's not linear that way. Well, that's the first half of the introduction this afternoon. The second half is this, and like I said, it's kind of, my talks are like episodes in free association, so you're going to have to connect the dots later. This is more reflection on an experience I had back in it kind of came to me when I keep a journal, and I was looking back in, November, December, I was looking back at October's journal entries, and I'm going to describe my experience during about a 2-week period as a bishop. Okay, and your bishops would be experience is probably the similar. Sometimes we go on these runs of 10 days, 2 weeks, where we make 15, 20, 25 presentations or appearances or engagements and that kind of stuff. And I was on one of those runs, and so here's what that looked like. I teach regularly something called a PLD group, which is a pastor leadership development group, and the particular one I lead meets 4 hours once a month, and it's some of our young clergy, and we read different things and discuss it, and we had one of those 4-hour meetings during that 2-week period, and I got to say, it's so stimulating. We got into all kinds of things about the nature of congregations, the future of congregations, about why people come, about reaching those who've had no spiritual background. It was just thrilling, and then within that same time period, I know you don't recognize these churches or anything. It's just kind of from my own notes, but I was at the chartering service for a new congregation called Faith Bridge, which was actually a restart. It's a new church we started, and it struggled, and then we had to kind of just start over a couple of years ago, and now it's thriving. About 175 people there. I was there at the chartering, and we moved into a new facility, and it was just great and energetic, and it's interesting experience to be in a room full of people who never even knew there were Methodist bishops, and which is the way most of our new congregations are. As a matter of fact, come to think, that's the way a lot of and then I drove, actually on that same day, drove from there to Robertsville United Methodist Church, and this was a church of about 25, 30 people in attendance, and they were celebrating their 175th anniversary. And the young woman who's a pastor there has been there several years, just working part-time, but she can't wait to leave her full-time job so that she can give full-time service to this. And it's grown from about 12 to 16 to 20 to 25 and 30, and she loves it, and they love her, and it was just so thrilling to be a part of that. And then there was a pastor's group in Kansas City from the inner city, and we met and we spent about 4 hours together, and it was I did some talking about innovation as well as some of the other stuff going on in our conference, and just the engagement there was very positive. I was invited I was invited to preach at BMCR, an afternoon service in St. Louis, and the energy was so high and positive in that, and we just outlined why we do what we do as an annual conference and where we're going next, and about starting new congregations, and it was a great kind of experience. That was on an afternoon. That morning I preached 4 times at Manchester United Methodist Church to about 3,000 people, and they were having their culmination of their they called it extravagant generosity. It was this program that was leading up, and they took all their pledges and everything like that. And their giving was up 33%, their pledges or something like that. And I preached 4 times at that service. We have something called Pathways Partners. We realize that that the funding sources for new church starts, which are so critical to our future, so great that we're going to need other sources of funding. So Pathways Partners, I meet with laity and church leaders in kind of select groups across the conference several times a year, and I solicit large gifts to help with new church starts, and that allows us to have a very aggressive posture toward that. And so about 38% of our attendance in the Missouri Conference are folks who are members or part of new church starts in the last 25 years. So I'm happy to give every ounce of energy I can to that. Let's see. The Board of Ordained Ministry in October was having its kind of first fall, start of the quadrennium, and so I spent about an hour and talked about the values and expectations that I just really was hoping would drive the Board of Ordained Ministry in these years to come. And I could go on. I actually have about 4 or 5 other things on the list, but all this is in about a 2-week period. But something else was going on in that 2-week period. I serve on the board of directors of St. Paul School of Theology. And one of the meetings I went to was a lunch and kind of open forum as St. Paul was discussing its future and presenting its plans to whoever wanted to come. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay. Wow. Who could have imagined that, 5 years ago, they were asking for my help to help in capital funds campaigns to improve their buildings. And now we're having discussions about what to do with the property. One of our 13 United Methodist seminaries. Also in that same 2-week period, I received news. Now, I'm kind of fond of Cokesbury. we're good friends. So I was surprised, like many of you, to discover that they were going to close all 38 of their stores and the 19 seminary locations and completely get out of any kind of located sales plan and go entirely online and special events and things like that. Well, in a way, from a strategic point of view, business point of view, this actually makes sense, and if anything, maybe they should have done it 4 or 5 years ago. I understand. I've heard all the reason, but that's a pretty significant change for those of us gathered in this room to think about. Who would have imagined 5 years ago or 10 years ago, oh, no Cokesbury stores, entirely online. Well, also in that 2-week period, I was a part of several conversations about General Conference, and there was received back the results of several judicial council decisions. And I'm not going to go into great length on that, but boy, could I. But one of the things I've had to get my mind around is what does it mean that that ministry studies that worked for 4 years present something, it's voted up by 70%. Somebody calls a question on that, challenges it, and so they vote again, 70% to support it, and it's considered entirely repugnant to the Constitution and thrown out. And that plus the whole restructuring thing, plus what does it mean that we have a whole episode of instances where large conferences, annual conferences, jurisdictional conferences, general conferences, vote 60, 70, 80% for something, and it ends up not being valid. Now, can you see the little schizophrenia that's going on as a leader in the church? Is on the one hand, it's like this heat map with these signs of light and things that are just lighting up and bright and new ministries and all that. On the other hand, it's like, whoa, what's going on? I like to compare this. I hate to compare this to the polar ice cap. Now, we all know, we can stay up all, late at night arguing, is it man-made, is it this, or, but we all know that that the polar ice cap is melting. There is no argument about that. And we know it's been slowly melting for 50 years, don't we? Well, that's a kind of metaphor for the United Methodist Church. We know that there's been a slow melt going on there in the United Methodist Church in the United States. As a matter of fact, before General Conference meets 4 years from now, the melting in the United States will be the equivalent of losing 5 Oklahoma conferences. Okay? Or 3 Missouri conferences. That if the next 4 years between now and General Conference are like the last 4 years, there'll be about 240,000 fewer people in attendance in United Methodist churches. But that's the slow melt, right? we hardly notice it because it's just kind of been going on and a little here and a little there. But what this feels like is if you watch the Discovery Channel or Nature Channel, every once in a while there's like this ice shelf the size of New Jersey that breaks off. And you go, whoa, you know, what do these mean? You know, I don't want to push this metaphor too far, but if we're like the ice, if you know, Methodist Church is like the polar ice cap, you and I are the polar bears. We're going to have to learn to swim. We're going to have to learn to eat something different. We're going to have to adapt our habitat. We're going to have to, and if you think you're safe just because you're in Oklahoma and pretty strong conference, that just means you're a polar bear further back on the ice cap. You know, so these are challenges. Now, that's the reason I feel like it's worthwhile to talk about change in the church, especially innovation, experimentation, exploration, responsible risk-taking. And my hope today is that through this conversation, it kind of stimulates you to some new ways of thinking and maybe gives you permission for some new approaches. And so I've got 6 points I want to make. And these, I suppose they could be in almost any order, and some of this will be new to you. Some of it maybe you've heard 100 times before. But the first couple of these are about just conceptual changes in the Methodist Church. The second are about some second, third, or first two, second, third, numbers 3 and 4. Well, anyway, you'll just see it all come. The first is this. There's a book that came out probably 8 or 10 years ago now that was widely read. It was on the bestseller list, and then it kind of, you know, it was there for a year or two and then faded back. But I don't think the United Methodist Church ever caught its significance because it never uses the word church anywhere in the whole book. But the first thing I would say here is that the world is flat. And we haven't figured out in the United Methodist Church exactly what that means. Now, are anybody familiar with that book, Thomas Friedman? He makes the point that globalization centuries ago was country to country, that countries related to countries, and that's the only kind of global relationships there were. And then it evolved into company to company, and for a long time what was global was companies, you know. But he makes the point, and this is where he goes with this idea the world is flat, is nowadays globalization is person to person. That you know, some of you right here, as I'm speaking, could be you know, tweeting or whatever it is to people in Korea or Africa or whatever. And I mean, it's instant and it's person to person, right? And when I say that we haven't figured out what that means, I'm gonna just draw a picture here of how things were as late as when I started in ministry, but it had happened this way for years before that. And I'm going to draw this kind of pyramid up this way, and I want to imagine that you're an inspired layperson in a congregation who comes up with this idea that I think I've been reading about conditions and situations in the church in Mozambique, and I think we ought to build a parsonage for a pastor in Mozambique, because I understand housing is an issue there and stuff. So you're over here, and you're a lay person here, and what do? You tell your pastor, okay? And if your pastor gets inspired and your congregation gets inspired, he or she may even talk to the DS and say, hey, we're thinking about this, and what do you think? The DS might say, well, take it to the conference committee. And it would be a conference committee on missions of some sort, and they would look at this and they'd compare it to other projects, and they'd say, this is a very worthwhile project. We ought to build a parsonage in Mozambique. And so what do? They take it to finance, conference finance, and it goes into the apportionments, and it's approved at annual conference. And so how many churches are there in Oklahoma? 530. Okay, so all 530 churches are going to do their share and we're going to put this in the apportionments, and then we're going to gather that money, and we're going to send it to the General Board of Global Ministries. Now, this is 25 years ago, 30 years ago, right? And then what are they going to do? There was an office for Africa that was kind of the distribution point for this, and so that money would go to Africa, and then it would probably go through the bishop and the annual conference office there, and then it would go through the DS and down to the pastor, and the parsonage would be built. Most of our systems in the United Methodist Church are built to support that kind of concept of ministry. How does it happen today? Pastor, layperson, church right here wants to build a parsonage in Mozambique. Well, let's get online and make contact with a pastor and right there it goes, bing, and it's just straight across. Now this has been emerging for some years, and there are even kind of organizational expressions of this change that as a church we resisted until it became so overpowering that we received. And so one of those would be volunteers in mission. I mean, volunteers in mission was an early expression of this. Our team just goes there and does that ministry. And it doesn't take, mounting the whole Normandy invasion to do it. We just go do it, right? And in all honesty, I'm not here blaming, scapegoating. I didn't want this tone. There's no tone of that in this. But in all honesty, that met with great resistance at first through the general boards. Because wait, you don't have our expertise. You don't have the accountability. You don't have the this. You don't. And so there was resistance until that became so popular that it just kind of broke through. What about conference partnerships? Conference-to-conference partnerships that then cultivate church-to-church partnerships and stuff like that. Those things are all an expression of the new flattened world, that the world is flat, and you don't need the big structure to make it all happen. And now I could go on and on with examples about this. This is no small thing. This is a huge shift in the way we do things. I'd met with the cabinet last week, and we were kind of sharing good experiences. Christmas Eve. We have several of our larger congregations, well, many of our small congregations too, but some of the big numbers are connected to the large congregations that raised, $250,000 at their Christmas Eve service. And here's one example. One of our churches raised $250,000 at our Christmas Eve service to support the work that they're doing in Ghana. And the pastor there met with the president of Ghana back a few months ago and got his picture taken with it. And I'm sitting there thinking, is there a United Methodist? I don't even remember. Do we have a United Methodist? It's like they didn't ask me. It didn't go through me. It didn't go through our conference. It didn't go through the general board. It just went, right? Now, does that cause me some concern? No, it causes me to ask some questions. What's your system of accountability? How are you going to measure results? I mean, it causes me to ask half a dozen questions, but I got to say, I would be foolish to fight that. That is real, substantive ministry. And the best thing I ought to do is get out of the way and bless it, but ask the right questions so that to avoid the pitfalls or the dangers that might be inherent in that. The world's flat. Boy, God bless so many of you in this room for your help to us in Missouri, Joplin, May 22nd, 2011, when that tornado struck. There was somebody from UMCOR that was there in the first 24 hours. UMCOR money arrived about, I want to say, 6 to 9 months later. But you know what happened in the meantime? Money was flowing into the Missouri Conference. Money was flowing directly to those churches. Work teams were showing up. They were getting to work. Some of them with extraordinary effectiveness, but it wasn't being, it needed minimal coordination. Now, were there problems with that? Yeah, some of it got chaotic. Some people were bringing stuff that wasn't needed. So there needed to be those questions about accountability and feedback, those kinds of things. But if you actually put the dollars to how much money and help came to Joplin to help rebuild through directly kind of, I don't know how to word these, kind of either through us at the Missouri Conference or directly to those churches, it is far more than ever came through the whole denominational structure. And that's going to continue. If the same thing happened 10 years from now, it would be even more so that way. When Hurricane Sandy, the storm hit the Northeast, who was out of the chute and on the ground before we could even, before we even knew about it? Folks from Joplin. The most experienced of the church leaders in Joplin were the most essential things we had to offer the folks. And it was not going, we were aware of it through our conference offices and through our conference missions. We have a very robust mission kind of ministry, but all that was almost more a traffic signal thing of just some coordinating kind of thing, but it wasn't being sent or generated from there. The world is flat. Now, I gave you a general church example, but have you ever stopped to think about it that this is exactly the way most of our annual conferences do new church starts and campus ministries and a whole host of other things? I mean, here's the campus ministries. Here's a church, and here's a campus that is 6 blocks away. How do we do campus ministries? I think we ought to be doing something over there. Well, let's take it up with the conference committee and let's get it into the budget, and let's assign it through up here and over here, and then let's distribute it down this side, and let's do this, and let's do that. And finally, so campus ministries becomes the responsibility of everybody, but unfortunately, when that happens, it often becomes the responsibility of nobody. And so often what happens, and I know nothing about your context, so I'm talking about my context, where I was appointed to a conference that had 13 campus ministries that was reaching by their own reports a total of 250 students, and at the cost of $900,000 a year. And when we kind of drilled down to figure out what's going on, what we found is this church over here, as long as that money's coming from over there, there's no direct line of accountability. So the fact that only 6 students are involved and it's costing $100,000 doesn't matter. Right? But if that were their own ministry, it would matter. And so what we did is we redid all of our campus ministries so they are like this. And there is, and the evaluation, feedback, benchmark happens at the conference, but they're congregationally based. This is the way, new church starts, same thing. Boy, when I started in ministry, remember, Bill, we'd go out and buy 5 acres. Conference would buy 5 acres. How would that happen? It would come from the churches. It would go up. There was a district locations, conference, this, that, and the other, and then down this other side. And so we'd build a new church that would be in an area that often the local churches around didn't even know what was going on. Now, our biggest, in Missouri, our biggest resource for starting new churches is other churches right in the area, is starting second sites, initiating new conversations, and so forth. I could go on and on. Some of these get funny. And do you realize 530 churches? 530 churches contribute to the Episcopacy Fund. And all of that gets gathered in the conference office here. It's sent to GCFA at a central headquarters. And so when your bishop wants a new printer, he and his assistant has to go through a process to request the funding to release those funds to buy that printer. Now, why? Because that's the way it always used to be done. I mean, that's the way General Motors would do it. It's the way the U.S. government would do it. I could give you lots of good models for... And there are issues of accountability. that is the reason that it's done that way. But if you actually track a dollar and you know, it just circles around and around, it gets kind of crazy. And so the world is flat. And friends, our church hasn't absorbed this reality.